1 minute and 5 seconds. That's how long it took Paraguay to score the fastest goal of the entire 2026 World Cup. Matías Galarza connected with a long-range shot almost from the kickoff whistle, and by the time most fans in San Francisco Bay Area Stadium had settled into their seats, the scoreboard already read 1-0. What nobody in that stadium could have predicted is that Galarza's afternoon was only just beginning to get strange. 45 minutes later, with tempers still simmering from a hard foul and a brief scuffle between both sets of players, referee Ivan Barton's watch came loose and fell to the turf during the confrontation. Galarza, the same man who'd scored the opening goal, picked it up off the ground, and instead of handing it straight back to Barton, he put it on his own wrist and wore it for several minutes before eventually returning it. That single strange image, a World Cup goalscorer wearing the match official's watch on his own arm in the middle of a live international fixture, became one of the most shared moments of the tournament's second week. But it wasn't even the strangest thing to happen in that match, because minutes after Galarza's watch moment, his own teammate became the answer to a piece of football trivia that didn't exist a month ago: the first player in World Cup history sent off for covering his mouth. Turkey lost 1-0. Their World Cup ended that afternoon, eliminated from Group D before they'd even played their final group match. And somehow, the result itself has barely been the headline. Let's go through exactly what happened, piece by piece, because this match has quietly become a perfect window into several of the biggest stories shaping this entire tournament. Start with the watch, because it's the moment that's generated the most confusion and the most jokes online, and it deserves to be properly explained rather than just a strange clip circulating without context. The incident happened in the 45th minute, right on the edge of halftime. Tensions between Turkey and Paraguay had been building through the half, and a hard foul triggered a brief confrontation between players from both sides. Referee Ivan Barton, the Salvadoran official in charge of the match, stepped in to separate the two camps, as referees do dozens of times in any given match. Somewhere in that physical exchange, his watch came loose from his wrist and fell onto the pitch. Galarza found it on the ground, and rather than simply scooping it up and handing it straight back to Barton, he strapped it onto his own wrist and continued playing with it there. Cameras caught the entire sequence, and it spread immediately. For several minutes, the goal scorer of the match was walking around an international football pitch wearing the referee's watch while the match continued around him. He did eventually return it, a few minutes later, with no fuss and no further incident. He wasn't booked for it specifically, even though, as several outlets covering the moment pointed out, he'd already picked up a yellow card earlier in the match for an unrelated incident. Patrick Ittrich, a former German referee now working as a pundit for Magenta TV's World Cup coverage, was visibly baffled when asked about it on air. "What's going on in a player like that?" he said, struggling to find a clean explanation for behavior that simply doesn't have a precedent in the modern game. There's no indication this was malicious, and nobody covering the story has suggested Galarza intended to keep the watch or cause any genuine problem for the official. It reads, by every account, as a strange, almost childish impulse in the heat of a chaotic moment. Pick up the thing that fell, put it on, get distracted by the continuing match, and forget to immediately hand it back. But the optics of it, a player effectively in possession of a referee's personal property for several minutes during a World Cup match, with no clear protocol anyone could point to for how that should be handled, is exactly the kind of moment that exposes how unprepared football's rulebook can be for situations nobody ever anticipated needing to write a rule for. Think about how many different ways this could have gone wrong. If Barton had needed his watch back urgently for any reason, there was no established process for retrieving it. If Galarza had simply forgotten he was wearing it and it had become damaged or lost during the remainder of the half, there's no precedent for how that would even be addressed afterward. None of that happened here. The watch came back, Barton put it on, and the match continued without further incident. But the fact that commentators, former referees, and football writers around the world spent real airtime and column space trying to work out what the appropriate response should have been tells you something about how granular the gaps in football's existing rulebook actually are, even after years of incremental law changes. It's also worth saying plainly that this kind of moment simply wouldn't have existed in the same way without modern broadcast coverage. A referee dropping and recovering a personal item happens, presumably, more often than anyone realizes in lower-profile matches with far less cameras trained on every square foot of the pitch. It's the sheer density of camera angles at a World Cup, the kind of coverage that can isolate a single wrist for several seconds without missing a beat of the broader action, that turned a 15-second curiosity into a global talking point within the hour. Now here's where the match takes its second, far more significant turn, because what happened next wasn't a quirky human moment, it was history, and it directly connects to one of the most debated new rules at this entire World Cup. In the third minute of stoppage time at the end of the first half, Paraguay's Miguel Almirón became involved in his own confrontation. Following another foul near midfield, Almirón exchanged words with Turkey's right back, Mert Mulder. In the middle of that exchange, Almirón covered his mouth with his hand while speaking. Mulder immediately appealed to referee Barton for punishment. Barton went to video review, and within moments he showed Almirón a straight red card. It was the first time in the history of the World Cup that a player has been sent off specifically for covering his mouth during a confrontation. The rule itself is brand new, introduced by FIFA and the International Football Association Board specifically ahead of this tournament, and its origin traces back to a Champions League incident earlier this season involving Real Madrid's Vinicius and Benfica's Prestiani, where a player covering his mouth while speaking made it impossible for officials to verify an allegation of racial abuse one way or the other. Under the new law, intent doesn't need to be proven, and the content of what was said doesn't need to be established at all. The act of covering his mouth during a confrontation with an opponent or an official is by itself now enough to trigger an automatic red card. Almirón's case became the very first test of that rule on the World Cup stage, and it happened in all places, a fixture against Turkey that had already produced one of the tournament's strangest individual moments just minutes earlier. Paraguay finished the half down to 10 men. They were already leading 1-0 from Galarza's early strike, and Turkey now had an extra man and over 45 minutes to find a route back into the match and salvage their World Cup campaign. They couldn't do it. 10-man Paraguay held on. The scoreline stayed exactly as it had been since the opening minute, 1-0, and Turkey's World Cup ended there, eliminated from Group D with one group match still left to play. For a country with one of the most passionate, vocal fan bases in international football, a campaign that many had genuinely hoped could produce a deep run ended not with a whimper exactly, but with a level of strangeness that nobody could have scripted. A goal scored in barely a minute, a watch worn by the wrong person, a historic red card for a gesture that 18 months ago wouldn't have drawn so much as a raised eyebrow from anyone watching. So what does all of this actually expose about FIFA's biggest problem at this World Cup? It's not really about Galarza's watch, charming and bizarre as that moment was, and it's not really about whether Almirón's red card was technically correct under the letter of the new law, because by every account it was applied exactly as written. The real problem this match exposes is about a tournament's rules outrunning its players' instincts in real time on the very biggest stage the sport has. The mouth-covering rule exists for a genuinely defensible reason. Football needed some mechanism to prevent players from shielding the one piece of evidence, what was actually said, that makes serious confrontations provable or unprovable. FIFA President Gianni Infantino said as much directly when explaining the rule's logic earlier this year. If a player covers his mouth and says something with a racist consequence, he has to be sent off, because there's otherwise no way to hold him accountable. That's not an unreasonable position to take. But Almirón's sending off illustrates exactly the tension critics raised the moment this rule was announced. He wasn't accused of saying anything racist. There's been no suggestion the exchange with Mulder involved anything beyond a heated, ordinary football argument, the kind that happens dozens of times in any given match without consequence.
He covered his mouth, most certainly out of old habit rather than any deliberate attempt to hide wrongdoing, and the rule didn't ask whether his intent was malicious or completely innocent. It simply applied the maximum possible sanction the moment the gesture occurred. That's the trade-off FIFA built into this law deliberately, prioritizing a clean, unambiguous, universally enforceable standard over one that requires referees to make a judgment call about context and severity in the heat of the moment. The Vinicius and Prestiani situation that triggered this rule change genuinely had no clean resolution, precisely because there was room for interpretation and no hard evidence either way. FIFA's solution removes that ambiguity entirely. But removing ambiguity from the rule doesn't remove it from the moment a player actually makes the gesture out of pure reflex, with absolutely nothing to hide, and finds himself walking off, having effectively gifted the opposition a man advantage in a World Cup match that ends his country's World Cup hopes. Multiple incidents across the tournament's opening fortnight have already shown players falling into this exact trap, almost by accident, before fully retraining a habit that's been part of football's unwritten culture for decades. Almirón's case is simply the most consequential version yet, because it happened in a match Turkey ultimately lost by the same single-goal margin Paraguay had banked in the opening minute, and it happened on the global stage of a World Cup rather than in a routine domestic fixture where it might have passed with far less scrutiny. Compare this to how other new rules introduced for this same tournament have played out so differently in practice. The mandatory hydration breaks, for instance, were also designed with good intentions, built around genuine heat-related science, and they too have collided with the lived reality of the tournament in ways FIFA likely didn't fully anticipate, generating boos and commercial backlash rather than the smooth, universally appreciated welfare measure it was pitched as. The pattern across both situations is strikingly similar. A rule gets written in a meeting room with a clear, defensible rationale. It then meets the actual texture of a 6-week global tournament, played by thousands of individuals, each carrying their own decades of muscle memory and instinct, and the friction between the two produces exactly the kind of moment nobody designing the rule quite pictured.
The walk-off protest rule, introduced around the same time as the mouth-covering law and stemming from the chaos of an Africa Cup of Nations final, hasn't yet been tested on this World Cup stage in the same dramatic fashion, but it sits in the same family of legislation, designed reactively in response to a single high-profile flashpoint, then applied universally and unconditionally across every match, regardless of context. Almirón's red card is simply the first concrete data point showing exactly how that kind of legislation behaves once it meets a real, unscripted, emotionally charged moment between two players who have nothing more sinister going on than an ordinary argument after a hard foul. And the watch incident, while far less serious in football terms, points towards something related. Football's rulebook, even after IFAB's recent additions, still doesn't have a clean, established protocol for what happens when a referee loses a piece of personal property on the pitch and a player picks it up. Nobody seriously thinks this needs its own dedicated law, but it's a small, telling reminder that a sport played at this speed, intensity, and scale will always keep producing situations the rulebook hasn't fully anticipated, and officials and broadcasters are left improvising real-time explanations for moments nobody quite knows how to categorize. Put both incidents from the same 90 minutes together and you get a clear picture of where football currently sits, a sport trying, in good faith, to modernize its accountability standards and its disciplinary clarity, colliding directly with players whose instincts, habits, and reflexes were built over years inside a completely different rulebook. The gap between the two hasn't closed yet, and matches like Turkey versus Paraguay are exactly where that gap becomes visible to millions of people watching at once. Turkey's elimination is now confirmed barring an extraordinary swing in goal difference elsewhere in the group, and their tournament will be remembered, fairly or not, partly through the lens of this single chaotic match rather than purely through their performances across the group as a whole. Paraguay, despite finishing the contest with 10 men, move on with a result that matters far more than the strange story around it, and a place in their group very much still alive heading into their final fixture. There's a broader context worth sitting with here too, because Turkey arrived at this tournament carrying real expectations. This was a squad many analysts had pegged as a legitimate dark horse heading into the group stage, built around a generation of players performing at a high level across some of Europe's top leagues. Losing to a tournament debutante adjacent side like Paraguay in a match where the actual goal arrived inside the opening 65 seconds before most fans had even settled into their seats is the kind of result that invites exactly the sort of second-guessing and what-if conversation that follows underperforming favorites out of every World Cup. Mulder's role in triggering Almirón's red card has, fairly or not, become part of that conversation too, with some pundits suggesting the Turkish defender was simply doing what any player in his position would do by appealing to the referee, while others have framed it as gamesmanship that directly cost Paraguay a man and arguably should have evened out the playing field rather than tilting it further away from Turkey. What's harder to dispute is the scoreline itself. Paraguay led from the first minute and never trailed. Even with 10 men for the entire second half, they organized themselves well enough defensively to protect that single-goal advantage against a Turkish side that, by most match statistics, dominated possession and territory for long stretches without finding the breakthrough they needed. That's its own story about discipline and resilience under pressure, somewhat overshadowed by everything else this match produced, but worth recognizing on its own terms. Holding a one-goal lead with a numerical disadvantage for 45 minutes against a team many had tipped to advance from the group is no small achievement, whatever the surrounding circumstances. Social media reaction in the hours after the match split roughly along the same lines you'd expect. Turkish supporters expressed frustration, much of it directed at the disciplinary process that left their opponents down a man without ultimately changing the outcome, alongside genuine disappointment at a tournament exit that felt avoidable. Paraguayan fans, meanwhile, leaned fully into the bizarre celebrity of the watch moment, with Galarza's image wearing Barton's timepiece becoming one of the most repurposed and joked-about screenshots of the tournament's second week, appearing in memes, fan edits, and even a few good-natured comments from Barton himself in interviews afterward, where he reportedly took the entire episode in good humor rather than treating it as any kind of disrespect. What do you make of the mouth-covering rule after seeing it actually applied for the first time on this stage? Does a clean, zero-tolerance standard like this one feel like the right call to you, even when it catches a player who almost certainly had nothing to hide? And what do you think was actually going through Galarza's head in that moment with the watch? Pure instinct, a bit of mischief, or something else entirely?